This conference will now be recorded.
Hello, CAA members, fellow carriage drivers. Tonight we'd like to welcome to the CAA webinar series Richard V.C. Nicoll, who retired from Colonial Williamsburg Foundation as the Director of Coach and Livestock Department, where he managed carriage and horse operations at the historical area, as well as the oxen, rare breeds of cattle, sheep, pigs, and poultry. He was also formerly the chairman of the driving committee for the FEI and served as course designer for several FEI World Equestrian Games. Tonight he is speaking on the history of the whip. Welcome, Richard. Carol, if you can turn off your mic, and if Richard, if you can turn your mic on.
Okay, Kathleen, can you hear me?
I can now. Okay.
Okay, well, good evening, everyone. Hopefully you can see the slides. This is the first time I've done something like this online, so we'll see how it goes. Tonight, my lecture is on the history of whips, fairly short, but gives you an idea perhaps how whips were developed, particularly for the carriage industry. The origin of the word, the Middle English word, was probably from Middle Low Germany and Middle Dutch, called wipen or swing, leap or dance, from a Germanic base meaning to move quickly. The noun is partly from the verb reinforced by the Middle Low German wipe or quick movement. The meaning of it is an instrument, either a flexible rod or a flexible thong or lash attached to a handle and used for whipping. Of course, it can be used for anything to drive. We're going to concentrate mainly on those used for carriages, the early uses and the type to begin with. This is a simple but sophisticated tool, probably one of man's earliest tools in his domestication of animals. But you could also say one of man's advanced tools. This slide shows you a fighter jet and a whip. They do both have something in common. They both break the sound barrier. One just broke it a little earlier than the other one. The Egyptian, Greek, Roman, and other cultures in the Mediterranean area were the prime users of chariots. And I had to say in my original talk where I talked about them, also now we're seeing more and more evidence of the Chinese as well, using extensive use of the chariots. And with this vehicle, we see a more sophisticated whip in use. Toby Wilkinson, in his book Ancient Egyptians, wrote, "In driving, the Egyptians used a whip like the heroes and charioteers of Homer, and this, or a short stick, was employed even for beasts of burden and for oxen at the plow, in preference to the goad, a goad being basically a straight stick. The whip consisted of a smooth, round wooden handle, which you can see in the picture, and a single or double thong. It sometimes had a lash of leather or string about 2 feet in length, either twisted or plaited, and a loop being attached to the lower end. The archer was then able to use the bow while the whip hung suspended from this whip, as you see in this slide. After the Roman Empire period of history, approximately 500 AD, there is little further development of carriages and, of course, roads. It wasn't until the 16th century and the reign of Queen Elizabeth I that we see the increasing use of carriages. These vehicles were crude and heavy vehicles and were as much for the ceremony as utilitarian use. They were driven by coachmen, as you can see here, either on the coachman's seat or by riding the horses pulling the carriages. The whips used were simple, basically a stick with a leather thong attached. Due to the conditions of the road, I'm certain these whips were used pretty liberally. Most vehicles were driven by a coachman, though, and we have some evidence of even famous people driving their carriage. We find quoted in a London paper in about September 1654, Oliver Cromwell, who you see in the picture, was riding in a carriage in Hyde Park, the carriage being pulled by 6 Friesland horses sent to him by the Duke of Oldenburg. He resolved to try with his own hand the mettle of these horses. Cromwell drove pretty handsomely for some time, but at last, provoking the horses too much with the whip, they grew unruly. The postilion was thrown. Cromwell fell from the coach box onto the pole and from there to the ground. His foot caught in the harness and he was dragged along for a moment, but soon extricated himself. He had to be bled afterwards and confined to his bed for 3 weeks. So accidents was happening even then also. It was not until the 18th century that there was a great increase of owner-driven vehicles such as Phaetons. In the latter half of the 18th century, fashions in owner-driven carriages was taken to extremes by the use of such vehicles as the high-flyer Phaeton, as you see here, with 6 horses. And note also the postilion on the front of that. Also single-horse vehicles such as chairs and chaises being used. The whip also being something that is now lighter and not the workman-like ones seen and used by professional stage coachmen. You can see the whip being held by this coachman is quite heavy. These owners who are driving the private vehicles started to demand more sophisticated carriages and equipment. This also included the whip, though still of the basic type of a thong attached to a stick. It is at the end of the 18th century we see the emergence in England of what we now call the Bowtop Folly whip. This is a wooden stick with a thong attached at the top of the stick, not as before by a loop of leather at the top. What is the reason for this? The reason, of course, is it makes the thong stand out from the stick. So when you want to catch it back on the stick, it's not already stuck to the side of the stick, which so often happens with a thong that is just on a loop at the end. The stage coachmen in England were the artists in the use of the coach whip, and their style was copied by the young bloods of the day. Whips, of course, came in all shapes and sizes, depending on the use, both for coaching, owner-driven vehicles, commercial vehicles, carters, wagoners, and agricultural use, as well as for riding. In the carriage world in Europe, we end up with 2 basic types of which I will call the Bowtop whip and the drop thong whip. The lighter Bowtop whips being used by the fancier vehicles and the more utilitarian vehicles used as a heavier, stouter whip. In parts of Eastern Europe, they would use the drop thong whip and never really went to the Bowtop whip. In the US, a third whip was developed, which we know as a buggy whip, a long flexible stick with a snapper of silk, etc. at the top, which I'll talk about later. The Bowtop whip that we know today is used to touch the horses with a thong and not the stick. These whips were made using a variety of materials, by far the most common being holly. They were also being made using blackthorn, hickory, yew, lancewood, malacca, and even whalebone. The drop thong whip could be used to make a crack to urge the animals on. These 3 styles were each developed and increased in sophistication right through to the end of the carriage era in the early 20th century. How were these whips made? The industry in England started more as a cottage industry, with perhaps a central dealer putting all the parts together. This very much followed this trend in the UK until the 18th century, when we see the emergences of businesses explicitly for producing whips, both for riding and driving. The slide you're seeing right now shows a coachman's whip with a drop thong lash, and then the fancier Bowtop whip from the 19th century. Harness whip makers such as John Ross, who was a saddler who set up a whip manufacturing in 1760 in Marylebone in London. He produced both complete whips and parts. With all these earlier whips, early whip makers, their prime business was riding whips. By 1777, he had advertised himself as a whip maker to the royal family. And in 1798, he sold up the business to a whip maker named James Swain. Thus, we see the first association of the name Swain in the company today known as Swain, Adney and Brigg. And for those who used to buy whips from Swain, Adney and Brigg, they were very common. They don't handle it quite so much anymore. James Swain, who was born in 1766, had learnt the business from Benjamin Griffith and Son, who were whip makers. in 1782, and by 1799 he had set up his own business, Swain and Company. Another centre of the trade was in Walsall, Staffordshire, in the West Midlands, just north of Birmingham. It had since the Middle Ages been a centre of the Lorriners, Lorriner being someone who makes metal parts for bridles, etc., and the saddlery trade. And in conjunction with these trades, some of the earliest whip manufacturers were there. And the slide shows a whip being held by a huntsman, and these were probably some of the more common things they were making. Joseph Carver of Eldon Works in Walsall, a whip maker, was one of the oldest established whip making concerns in the town, and dating back to the reign of George III, who of course we all know about. In 1801, there were 4 whip and whip thong makers listed, and one of these whip makers was Joseph Carver. To illustrate the growing size of the industry, the Griffiths business in London by 1799 reputedly employed up to 130 workers. The workers involved in the whip business evidently performed highly specialized tasks in separate departments or workshops, including thong making, braiding, binding, buttoning, and finishing. Also, at the end of this century, we see the use of the earliest braiding machines. These machines used for the braiding of whipstocks. And here you see the very earliest braiding machine, which was basically the stick passed down into a barrel or pulled out of a barrel, and different threads being slowly wound around. Quite a laborious business, but apparently those who were used to doing it could do it fairly quickly. An early account book from Swain and Company in 1812 and 25 shows details of the business and gives us a glimpse of the material used in being delivered to the factory. Hides of varying types, holly and yew sticks. The best holly was said to come from the county of Kent. Also bamboo and cane. Whalebone that is truly actually baleen from the mouth of filter feeding whales such as the sperm whale. These cartilage-like plates from the mouths could come up to 13 or 14 feet long. It was both strong and flexible. It was really the plastic of the time. Also, catgut was used, usually goat or sheep guts, and many other smaller items for handles. These whip makers would also do bulk sales to other retailers and sales abroad. The picture you're now seeing is actually in an American whip factory from the earlier 20th century, and that is a rack filled with whalebone ready to be used. Some of the whip making companies in London we see at this time are the Callow of Park Lane, Parker of St. Martin's Lane, Souter of Sloane Square, George Schomburg of Long Acre, and even repairing whips, I occasionally come across Schomburg whips. You can always tell them they have very short butt pieces and ferrules. Holland of Shoreditch, Swain and Adney and Brigg, it is now, of Piccadilly, and Corley of Peterborough. The names on the whipsticks, keeping in mind they were buying parts from specialty makers, so it didn't always mean that they put the whole thing together. The Bowtop whip, what is it? It's made of a variety of woods, holly being the prime one. And below you see a picture there of holly and in its different forms. Also blackthorn, yew, lancewood, malacca, cane, and even whalebone. And here in the US, they were using hickory. It's made up of a selection of basic parts as shown here. The thong was often said to be made of pickled horsehide, being 8, 6, or 4 plaits, but now kangaroo. So basically, the brown piece of leather slide is used for the handle. The thong you can see has already been cut out. Next to the brown piece of leather are the 2 pieces of goose quill, which hold the thong onto the stick. Then you can see the stick, the handle, the butt piece, and the ferrule. So these are the basic parts, and there's one part missing there, which is a piece of whalebone, which is actually the black piece next to the goose quill. And that is actually the basic parts of a whip. A. Maudsley in Highways and Horses said, "It seems a strange thing when we consider it, that we should take the hides off dead horses, the hides upon which the lash may so often have descended, to make more lashes to beat more horses." Handpieces were covered with different leathers, even plaited whalebone. Now the slide, if we go back one, Kathleen, that slide is showing the goose quills. I always get asked, what were the goose quills used for? Were they inside? But actually the goose quill is used to bind the thong onto the stick. And you have to start with a basic quill, take the feathering off, and you only use one side of the quill. It's a thicker side, so you use quite a number of quills, and you have to use a very large quill, and normally they're only out on the end of the wing. Handpieces were covered with different leathers, even plaited whalebone, and sizes made for horses, fours, tandems, pairs, and singles, and also for ponies. Sticks varied in length, as did the thong length for horses and sticks was about 50 inches. Here you can see a thong ready-made, and then you can see how it was put on or see it on the stick on the right. So that's how it was put on. Then there was the style. You could purchase a regular straight stick, the most common, sticks with metal bands, parasol whips, which here you on the left, you can see a parasol whip for ladies, and jointed whips, handles with whistles and hunting cords. Then the sticks that were fashionable at the time, rabbit tune. They always said that rabbit tune whips, which is one on the right with a slight dog leg. The rabbit tune whips were where rabbits had chewed on the holly when they were growing. And then the dog leg whip. In The Private Stable by Jorrocks, the book, he quotes, "At one time a craze prevailed for whips with a crooked stick in imitation of that of Tom Hennessy's, a stagecoach driver, the famous dog leg coaching whip. But lately there's been a sensible reversion to the non-sporting straight stick for non-sporting vehicles." And I often come across people wanting dog leg whips, but evidently some of the older coachmen felt they were silly. The quality of the whip often seen in the handles, which were all varieties of materials. On the left, you can on your slide, you can see this is actually a whip maker's sample bag showing some of the handles that American whip makers would use. These are for American buggy whips, not necessarily for the English Bowtop whip. From the handles with plaited whalebone and perhaps gold ferrules and butt pieces, ivory handles, carved handles, then varying degrees of elaborate ferrules and butt pieces. And here you can see the types used perhaps not only for driving whips, but also for other uses. And this was often with nobility that would have things like this. I think the next slide. Here is when they put the leather on the handle, which is at the top of the picture, they would wrap newspaper around it to give it a taper. And the only way I've ever been able to date a whip is by carefully taking the leather off and reading the newspaper underneath, or by looking, if it was silver, it would have a hallmark. But it's interesting, some of the newspaper articles that come off whips, but you have to take quite a few of them apart to ever see this. It was generally recognized the professional coachman was the expert with whip, as described by the Duke of Beaufort in the book Driving. He said the English coachman carried in his right hand a work of art in a neat, jaunty, highly finished whip with a thong skillfully plaited, and he used it with grace, sometimes with an elegant flourish, just enough to remind a highly bred horse that he was not doing his best, or to remove a troublesome fly. At other times with resolution to chastise a sluggard who wished his mate to do all the pulling while he trotted along with a loose collar and traces. Edwin Hallett, who was recognized, and there's a picture of Edwin Hallett here, was recognized as one of the masters, teachers of driving, stated, "The whip is indispensable, and those who wish to learn to drive without it are very wrong. For later, when they wish to begin to carry it, they find it so much in the way that they put it back in the socket. I oblige my pupils to carry the whip from the first and compel them to keep it. I have no socket on my carriage." Later he said, "For there is not only a time but a place for each stroke, and the whip when used must be used intelligently in order to obtain desired result from your horses. It is hardly necessary for me to add that the unintelligent use of the whip is not only cruel, but worse than useless, and has been the cause of many an accident. He also had his preferences in whips, stating he preferred a heavy whip over a light one because he could touch the horse lightly with a heavy one, while impossible to strike hard with a light one. Captain Morley Knight, in his book Hints on Driving in 1895, said constant practice with the whip is absolutely essential. No one can drive well until he has a thorough control over it and is able to manipulate it in such a way that the horse struck is the only one which knows that it is being used. For pair and single thong is used to touch the horses or horses as described in detail by the writers of the time. With a four-in-hand, the lash is caught back on the whip, leaving a large loop at the top of the whip. This loop is used to touch the wheelers with, and the full length of the thong is used for the leaders. When I talked about a bow-top whip, really it's much easier to create a loop at the end of the whip when you have a bow-top whip. Normally, the writers at the time would recommend them hitting the leaders under the trace on their belly or between the collar and pad if reachable. Benno von Achenbach said it best. If a horse must be lightly encouraged, the lash of the whip, never the shaft, must stroke the horse on the outside, close behind the pad. If the horse requires a stronger aid, you should strike, without leaning forward over the horse, between the collar and the pad, underneath the tug, behind the shoulder. All the writers of the time described the difficulties of using a whip correctly and the amount of time necessary to master the art. Also, care of the whip and keeping the thong supple was emphasized by all. So where are we in the colonies or America in the development of the whip industry? The earliest carriage owners appear in the American colonies at the end of the 1600s. Most of these owned by governors of the colonies or wealthy merchants and mainly used within the larger towns, Boston, Philadelphia, New York, etc. However, as the populations grew in the 13 colonies, the roads improved, and there's a greater influx of imported carriages from England. We have to assume these earlier vehicles that were imported probably had even the appropriate whips imported with them, though no evidence of this. For other whips for riding, carting, wagons, etc., they were being made in the cottage industry, with only fancier whips being imported. However, by the middle of the 18th century, there is evidently enough business to maintain specialized whip making businesses with different manufacturers handling different parts of the industry, eventually reaching its peak by the end of the 18th century. So here on the slide, go back one if you would, Kathleen. Here we see an advert in the Pennsylvania Gazette, just imported from Bristol, half hunting and whole whips and chaise whips. Often you can tell which carriages are the most popular, but what they're selling the horse whips for. Then 1750, Henry Wright, a whip maker in Chestnut Street. Then the account books for George Washington, he ordered in October 1759, coach whips for 2 shillings and 6pence. And then Pennsylvania Gazette, 87, Samuel Scott, a whalebone cutter at number 383 Chestnut Street, states he has a good assortment of common cut whalebone. He also cuts and prepares whalebone in the English manner, which I'm not quite sure what that meant, equal to the British to suit for bonnet, stay, umbrella, and whip makers. Even in Williamsburg, Virginia, we see the harness maker Alexander Craig, and this is part of his account book, entering in his account book repairs on carriage whips. So here you can see in 1762 to a 4-horse thong, and then again a lash to a coach whip and to a chair thong, and then a coach thong and cord at the bottom in 1762. The whipmaker Henry Wright advertised in 1750 his business in Philadelphia, as did Israel Morris in 1754. In 1787, we find an advertisement of Samuel Cotton, which we saw advertising whalebone as a whalebone cutter. And John McAllister in Philadelphia in 1809 advertised carriage whips 48 to 50 inches long from $2 to $4, also gig and tandem whips. Whalebone being used in many. The picture you see here shows an early whip that I had that had a maker's name, Melody and David, of 8 Dock Street in Boston, and date of 1820, which was quite rare, having a date actually on it. I mean, you can see it, his ivory. It had a whalebone core and ivory ferrules, which shows the quality of the whip being made. Interestingly, this whip business came about when Barnabas Melody of Boston had taken over a whip business from his deceased brother, but not having sufficient funds to continue the business, had formed a partnership with Samuel David of Amherst, New Hampshire, thus forming the company of Melody and David. The business grew and they were able to open sales rooms in New York and New Orleans. One letter in the records of their company reported that they were selling ivory-mounted whips are becoming quite fashionable. Last week I sold $25 worth of that kind, and I wonder if that was not talking about that kind of whip. By the middle of the 19th century, the whip industry in the US grew to become a major industry in many parts of the country, but in particular Westfield, Massachusetts. This small town in western Massachusetts became known as the whip capital of America. Local law has it in 1808 that there lives supposedly a Westfield man named Joseph Jokes, who happened to become the owner of a choice lot of hickory. His many friends frequently called on him to be obliged with a piece of this wood for whipstocks, whips being then being homemade for everyday common use. Thus, we have the first recorded whips being made in Westfield. There's been a recent book just written that actually says that Joseph Jokes never existed, and it was some other people, but I think it made a good story to say how it started. By 1855, Westfield boasted approximately 30 whip factories. In 1866, this town held approximately 95% of the American market for whips and a good deal of the world market. By 1892, one whip company, the US Whip Company, was producing approximately 15,000 whips per day. Wow. The whip making reached its peak in 1893 when 42 companies were involved with whip production. Cargill and Cook in 1901 had 800 to 1,000 styles of whips that it made. After 1911, the whip industry declined rapidly. Whip making was a labor intensive, and fire was always a hazard for the whip companies due to the combination of materials used such as glue, lacquer, rattan, and the fumes and sawdust, etc., resulting from their use. And here you see a picture of, this is just showing rawhide and rattan in one of the whip factories. All these materials made an easily flammable mix. The sheer volume and variety of whips produced is amply described in different catalogs of the time. I think we go to the next slide. So here again, you can see a factory, and here they're working again on pieces of material. I think in that it's rawhide.
Richard, if I could just take a moment to remind everyone to mute their microphones, particularly those of you calling in on cell phones. Caller 1, please mute your microphone.
Here's another slide, and this actually still exists. This is the Westfield Whip Company, and this is a lineup of plaiting machines that the stick shaft is passed down through the middle, and the bobbins move around in a pattern that braids on the material onto the stick. And there was a row. This is only showing a partial row. And here we have a close-up view of it. You can see the hole in the top. That's where the stick passes through. And then the bobbins are moving around. And here's a set of bobbins that are on. Now, this is more modern material, not thread that was used in the earlier days. And this was probably the most sophisticated one. Now, this slide, if you just hold on it a minute, Kathleen, this slide shows the process of making a buggy whip. And what they've done is they've got a core of perhaps whalebone in the center or even rawhide. And then around it, they have rattan, which is glued together and then wrapped with this rope. And they had machines to do this a little bit behind hand. And then on the right shows you that they had another machine that they passed this through when it was all glued together. And it took it down to a tapered size, which is the one on the right, you can see. Okay, the next slide. So this is one of the catalogs. This is Mossman and Brothers showing you different whips in their catalog, and there are pages of these things. And these are the Bowtop whips with a few just straight stick whips shown in between. And these were just things you could buy. So here we have cab or coach whips, then express whips, which were used more by commercial drivers. And they would do hunting whips, dog whips, quirts, harvester whips. Harvester whips are interesting because they are very, very long and they have a very long stick. If you could go to the next slide. So here we have someone using a harvester whip, and you can see how long the stick is. The plaiting machines they used for the harvester whips had actually a hole in the floor so that as the stick was being plaited, it could pass down through onto the next floor because it was so long. And also here another picture is out west, so you can see the stick is enormous. So they made a variety of also handles, and this shows some of the handles they made, but they made them also that you could have your name plaited onto them. And this was a specialized way of doing it, and I've never really found out how they did it. But this was all done with thread. And the two whips on the bottom you can see were a husband and wife. It's Fred Stratton and his wife, Mrs. Fred Stratton, and both from Jaffrey, New Hampshire. And I still have these two whips, so it's quite interesting, a man and a woman. And then the one on the very, very bottom you can see, which has little white dots on it, that is actually all whalebone, and the little white dots are ivory. So this was quite a fancy one, very, very light. Like any good advertising, they also had good names for mainly the buggy whips. One of the whips produced was that used by the American stagecoach driver, but here we see some of the names, and this is only a very short list of some of the names they use. So the Giant Cracker, Bully Boy, Ben-Hur, Rough and Ready, Ira's Prompter. So they were Emily deciding on how bad your horse was, which one you wanted. One of the whips produced was that used by the American stagecoach driver, and the use of this whip is wonderfully described by Gary and Gloria Meyer in their book Knights of the Whip, Stagecoach Days in Oregon. They stated the stage driver's skill with his whip was as great as Robin Hood's with the bow and arrow. In its use rested much of the Jehu's reputation, the ancient king of Israel known for furious chariot attacks. Experience and long practice polished the veteran driver's skill to a sword's point. With his whip and reins, he could speak to his team with the loving murmur of a mountain brook, the warning of a buzzing bee, or the crackle and fire of the lightning gods. The whip was used as a signaling device to the horses. In the skilled hands of the veteran Jehu, the whip gave off scores of different tones and cracks, each with its own meaning and purpose. For example, when the driver wished the last burst of speed obtainable from his team, he gave them the silk, which meant the silken lash end or cracker had spoken the most powerful sound it was capable of, which means breaking the sound barrier. Usually the driver made his whip speak in a more subtle way, short and mild cracks to urge the team through a soft place in the road or up a grade. These were in conjunction with the rein work and the voice commands. And they truly were amazing drivers. The whip itself was a work of art. The whipstock was from 5 to 7 feet long, made from shaped and glued pieces of straight-grained hickory or oak. The butt was 1.5 to 2 inches thick, tapered rapidly for 2 feet. The taper was more gradual for the next 2 feet and maintained the same size from there to the end. where the latch was attached. The stock was usually ornamented with silver bands, sometimes engraved according to each driver's preference. We're still talking about the stagecoach driver. And the wood was well oiled and polished by the owner. The tip end of the stock was fastened the 8 to 10 foot long braided leather whiplash. The lash was not more than 5/8 of an inch thick. The whiplash maintains its size from 4 to 6 feet, then tapered the last few feet to 1/4 inch in thickness. It was made from bands of soft leather braided around a central core of interwound strands of linen thread and fine copper wire. Its strength was incredible. At the end of the whiplash was the cracker made of silk floss and shoemaker's thread, waxed and braided. The strain on and wear on a cracker was so great that it had to be rebraided and broken strands renewed at the end of every drive or trip. The factories producing all these whips became highly mechanized and had machinery for many of the phases of the whip production, in particularly plaiting machines. Many of these machines are still in use today in Westfield Whip Company, that is still in one of the original buildings in Westfield. And here you can see the original building. The scaffolding was due to a grant they got to restore it, the outside of the building. So now it's no longer that way. You can see the whole thing. Also, the town of Westfield put up this clock tower. And there you see the man with the barrel plaiting whips. And on the hour, these two men appear and come out of the clock. So Westfield still celebrates the fact that it was known as the whip city of the world. So when you go there today, if you ever go through Westfield, you can see this. So we go from the period in the 19th century when the train replaced the stagecoaches to the early 20th century and the introduction of the automobile. So after 1911, the whip industry declined rapidly. There remained a few manufacturers in towns like Westfield still producing for the limited market. We even have, as you saw, a clock tower commemorating this. Modern materials such as fiberglass, graphite, etc. now replace many of the original materials, but a whip is still a whip. Production today is almost exclusively for the pleasure horse world, and as such, there is still a high demand for whip, but nothing like the days at the end of the 19th century. If you go back one slide. So the London Gazette in 1912, you see here notice is hereby given the partnership of the undersigned Henry Schomburg and Arthur Schomburg closing the business. And that's they were one of the famous whip makers. I leave you with a few thoughts at the end of this talk. First, that this early tool, even though simple, that was advanced scientifically, broke the sound barrier. Secondly, that the carriage whip in its many forms still influences all still to this day in our everyday life. When you drive your car on the road, the side of the road you drive on in many ways was set by the drivers of coaches and wagons, who were influenced in where they sat by their use of the whip. And this in turn led to legislation on which side of the road they drove on. And we still stick to this day, most of us. This simple tool we still find is needed today when driving or riding horses, but is recognized to be used more as an aid than for punishment. Finally, we remember the era when the carriages were supreme and the whip had created a major industry. And I finished with just a video that I think you might find interesting, showing the early 20th century, showing when carriages were still being used in London. And when you see the number of vehicles driving around, you realize how many whips must have been produced.
Thank you, Richard. That was fascinating. It's always a great talk and just so interesting. We'd like to open it up now to questions. If you have a question, please type it into the chat feature. And I have to ask, Richard, what started you on the path to researching whips?
Years ago in the early 70s, I worked for Jack Seabrook and Tom Ryder down in New Jersey. Mr. Seabrook was using all original whips at the time, and we found up in one of his lofts a whole pile of broken sticks that he'd used and broken, but he didn't know where to get them fixed. So foolishly, I said, oh, I think I can fix those. And I started trying to fix whips. Well, I managed to do a reasonably good job. And then other people started sending me sticks, because you got to remember in the 70s, most people were still using original whips. So I was being sent all these original whips and slowly learnt by taking many, many of them apart, how they were put together. And that started getting kind of interested. And so I was buying books on anything on whips so if I could find out anything. But what you realized was an enormous amount of the knowledge of whip making was never passed on, written down, should I say. There was many books that kind of gave you an outline, but not exactly how they did it. So through the years, I've been, by doing it myself and talking to other whip makers who I've known through the years, mainly in England, and learning what they'd learned, and also just little tidbits picking up in different things. And Tom Ryder used to pass on anything he'd found. So that's how I became interested. And I have to say, with Westfield, Massachusetts, it's a little town just down the road from where I live now. So that became more interesting. And I know the lady who runs the Westfield Whip Company. So occasionally I go over and visit her. And it's an amazing factory. You're walking into the floor where she has all the machines, and you are literally walking back 100 years. All the same machines are still there.
And do they run those machines at all, or are they just
She
for
does very limited output. The biggest problem is she had a fairly skilled workforce, but as the demand came down, she was not producing so many, and she knows how to run most of the machines. But it takes someone running those plaiting machines to know what they're doing. And of course, if something goes wrong, how to fix them.
Yes, I
And
would
a
imagine
lot of
that
those
is
plaiting
much
machines are
skilled.
made right there in Westfield.
I would imagine finding replacement parts for that type of equipment would be fairly scarce.
Yeah, literally, if a piece breaks, you have to go to a machine shop and say, can you reproduce it?
Just as
And
a reminder, if you have a
she has a basement full of old machines also down in the bottom.
good to keep spare parts. If anyone has a question, you're welcome to type it into the chat feature. And we have several great comments back. Thank you for your time and great information. Very interesting and great illustrations. So well done. And what a great talk. Now, Kathy has a question. Is the Westfield factory open for visitors?
If you go, they have a website. If you go on the website, you can get hold of Kathy there, and she often will open up. If she is there, she will let you in. If you tell her you're from the Carriage Association and you're very interested, take a look. She loves to show people around. She's not always there.
So by appointment is the best way.
It's the best way. I definitely get in touch with her.
Fantastic. And of all the collection that you have, what is your favorite whip that you own?
Mine?
Yes.
I sold too many whips. I think I really like the ones from Jaffrey, New Hampshire, and Martha and I keep saying we'll go up to Jaffrey one day and see if the Historic Society is interested in them, because they have a Historic Society in Jaffrey, New Hampshire. And interestingly enough, I did buy those whips from an old gentleman who some of us still remember, who's passed away now, Alfred Sawyer, who lived in Jaffrey, New Hampshire. His son is still there, Lee. And I bought that pair of whips from Alfred, plus that other ivory whalebone one. And I got them all from Jaffrey. So my sense is I should take those two back to Jaffrey because they're pretty rare.
We recently found a whip believe it or not, at the thrift store, and it had the driver's name on the handle, like you showed, and we were able to track down the driver and send that whip to the correct historical society. But is there any way when you are looking at a whip to date it at all?
Well, as I said, the only two ways I know to date it, you could say if it was a Schomburg, you'd know it's not going to be later than when they folded. If it's got a silver butt piece or ferrule on it, it will have an English hallmark. On the whole, the higher end Bowtop whips, even those sold through American companies like Mossman's, came from England and therefore would have English hallmarks. And then the only other way, as I said, when you take the leather handle off, if it was wrapped in newspaper, which the older ones were, particularly the English ones, not brown paper, then you can often read the newspaper and if you're lucky, find a date on that. Also where it was made. Because you assume if it's a Walsall newspaper, it was a Walsall whip maker.
Well, thank you so much, Richard. We greatly appreciate your time, and as always, such a great and educational presentation. I just love the whip one. You always learn something new every time. So thank you so much for joining
My
us.
pleasure, Kathleen, and thank you, the Carriages Association, for doing this. I think it's a really great service you're doing. You and Jill are doing a super job.
Welcome. Thank you. Now, next week, Jeremy from the Remington Carriage Museum will be joining us, and he will be talking about Red River carts. So next Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, all of our CAA members are welcome to join us. Until then, everybody stay healthy.
Thank you.